1999. This is an advisory group to the governor composed of over 20 federal and state agencies. We'll have presentations in which we'll receive information critical to making our recommendation. I'll turn to my co-chair first to introduce himself and any opening remarks he has before we go around the table and introduce ourselves as members of the group. So members on the phone, we'll get to you after members around the table. And folks around the table, be sure to push the button on your microphone so folks on the phone can hear as well. So I'll turn to Anthony.
Good morning, Anthony Cox. Good to see you all again for the consequence management role that the Arizona Division of Emergency Management plays. Glad to see you all coming together. Look forward to hearing what subject matter experts have to say, and be happy to make a recommendation to you, Director, at the end of this meeting. Thank you.
Nancy.
Nancy Sullivan, State Climatologist. I'll be talking about the Monitoring Technical Committee.
My name is Mark O'Malley from the National Weather Service in Phoenix and co-chair of the Drought Monitoring and Technical Committee. Brad Esplin, Arizona Department of Water Resources. I'll be doing the Colorado River Water Supply Update.
I'm Stephen Flora. I'm a senior hydrologist with SRP. In our Surface Water Resources Group, I'll be talking about the Salt and Bertie watersheds and status of SRP reservoirs.
John Richardson with Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. I'm our Forestry Programs Administrator, and I'll be giving an update on our forest health conditions.
I'm Byron Kimball, also with Department of Forestry and Fire Management. I'm the State Fire Planner, and I'll be giving an update on the 2019 wildfire season.
Carl McClellan, Navajo Nation Water Management Branch.
My name is Nemesis Ortiz. I am the Drought and Water Conservation Coordinator for the Arizona Department of Water Resources.
Inav Henningson, Department of Water Resources.
Do we have anyone on the phone? Zach? So can the folks on the phone introduce themselves, please?
My name's Kathy Chavez. I'm with Pima County.
Thank you. Two other people?
Just Aswell Case with Bureau of Reclamation.
Thank you. Okay, and I think we'll then proceed with our agenda. It seems to me that unlike last spring, it's a little drier than it was when we met last spring. So I'm interested to hear the details. And we're starting with Nancy and update on the Monitoring Technical Committee activities.
Okay, so this is kind of the last 5 water years, and this is these are the entire water year, not just the winter. And so parts of the state would be wet, other parts would be drier than average. Kind of goes back and forth to sort of marginal years, not terrible. And then we got to the year a year ago, and we had one of the worst winters that we'd ever had. In fact, actually one of the worst water years that we'd had. It was extremely dry all across the state. And that followed by one that was actually one of the better ones. That was really nice. But then things happened. So last year we started October. The water year began with a tropical storm that came up and dumped a ton of precipitation in the southwestern part of the state, and that started off, and then we just had some rains beyond that. When we got to January, the northern half of the state was pretty much the picture because we were getting a lot of winter storms, which was wonderful, with tons of snow. Flagstaff did great. The ski areas did wonderful. That was good. We even had some spring precipitation in April and May, not so much in June, and then the monsoon came. Well, this is a year ago's monsoon, and it was near average. The white is about 100% of average, or basically average, and we had a little bit better conditions in southern Maricopa and western Pinal counties. The rest of the state was average to a little bit drier than average, but this year we had a great winter, and then we were followed with this horrible monsoon, which almost never really got started. That really wet spot at Cayentar is bad data. That didn't happen. The Navajo did not get flooded out. It wasn't a horrible thing. That was a one-day event that got incorrectly keyed into the NOAA database, and we haven't been able to get rid of it for some of the products. Anyway, so Maricopa County actually kind of did better than many of the other places, along with Cochise County, and the rest of the state was really much drier than average for the monsoon, so that did not really help us. So last year at this time, coming into the water year, we were in serious drought condition. The monsoon helped a little bit, but not a lot. And then we started going through our winter. So by February, we'd kind of gotten rid of most of that extreme, exceptional kind of drought conditions, and we had a lot of area that were now in no drought, which was really nice. By the time we got through the end of the winter, we'd really pushed it back just up into the northeastern part of the state. And then we came into the summertime, and nothing happened, and we didn't get our monsoon. So we have come back. This is the end of October as opposed to the end of the water year, because this is just kind of a continuation. We are still seeing this, and we've had to pull drought a lot back into the state. Severe drought is what we've got mostly up in the northeastern part of the state. And there's a little bit of the state that's in no drought down in the southwest. This is kind of a longer picture from 2000, so a really bad time here in 2002. But the previous dry winter is that last big red blip on the end, and that was a year ago's winter. Or a year ago's water year that gave us that. Then we came in and we had a really good winter, and now we're starting back into that drought situation. So we'll see what happens from here. The numbers a year ago in the October 2nd, 2018 column compared to now. So a year ago, none of the state had a no drought condition, and at the moment we still have 5% of the state without drought. But when we look at the extreme exceptional, 66% of the state was in extreme or exceptional a year ago. None of that is happening at the moment, but I'm not holding my breath. Depending on what happens as we move into this winter, we still have a lot of the state in moderate or severe drought, and that's just been creeping in through this dry summer that we had. So in terms of long-term, a year ago, this was the long-term situation. Most of the state was in extreme drought at least. And then we had that great winter that helped a lot of that, because it was a lot of the good snowpack that helped with the water resource kind of issues. But then in the summer, we started losing ground pretty good. So we're back not doing too good, particularly in the northeastern part of the state and west central and even east central Arizona. So this is kind of a different way to look at it. Some people like maps, some people do graphs. So this is the longer term look back from 1895, and so we're still at the bottom, and we still need to have a number of consecutive good years in order to bring us back up above that long-term average. So we're always hopeful, but. And then this is the other way we look at this. That U of A produces this map, and so that last big little brown streak across at the far end was that really dry winter we had in 2018. Then we had a little bit of green for this past winter, and now we're back towards some yellow and brown. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. Unfortunately, so far this water year, this is what it looks like. We're at less than 25% of average. And so for the monsoon, no place in the state had over an inch. 0.90 was the most that we had at Snowslide and Coronado. And so that's it was not Coronado. Yeah, I think it was Coronado. Anyway, hopefully we'll do better, and Mark's going to hopefully tell us where we might go from here. Hopefully not red.
Thank you. Any questions for Nancy?
Any predictions on the from the CPC regarding whether we're looking at an El Nino or La Nina?
That's all he's going to talk about. Hopefully it will be good news, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
Thank you. We've had another member join us. Would you like to introduce yourself? Thank you.
I tried to sneak in, sorry. Robert Rowley, Maricopa County Department of Emergency Management.
Thanks. Mark O'Malley will give us the winter 2019 to 20 weather outlook.
Thank you very much for having me again. Anyone who was here last year remembers I was cautiously optimistic about last winter, and it turned out fairly well for us. Unfortunately, this year, I'm much more pessimistic. This is not going to be a pleasant presentation for those hoping to see a lot of rain this winter. I am not optimistic at all. One thing that we saw last winter was the El Nino conditions, and it really worked out well for us. But it persisted well into the spring and early summer, much longer than usual. Now, that helped us in the spring where we did receive good precipitation at times when we normally don't see it. However, it did hurt our monsoon, and this was one of the contributing factors that really kind of never got the monsoon set in place for us. Now, we did go into a cooling period during the summer, and we have gone towards a neutral state. Recently, we have warmed back up in this Nino 3.4 region. However, I believe, and all climate scientists believe, that this is just a temporary spike and that we will remain neutral for the entire winter. So this is just some graphs showing that. In the bottom left, there are some members that want to push us into El Nino, but there's a few that want to push us into La Nina. By and large, most ensemble members show us hanging in the neutral range throughout the winter season. So there's really not going to be a lot of influence from the El Nino or La Nina as we head through the winter season. This is pretty much a non-event for us this year. So we have to look elsewhere into the Pacific. And one thing that really grabs me looking at this image is the amount of unusually warm water throughout much of the Pacific Basin. And the anomalies are quite pronounced. When we can look at teleconnections, and we can look all the way down into New Zealand. And what we've seen so far this fall and early in this cool season is a teleconnection with all this warm water producing strong high pressure over the East Pacific and the Southwest United States. This has been a predominant and persistent pattern for going on better than a month now. As long as this warm water sits out there like this may be the pattern that we sit in for much of the winter. And for the Southwest United States, this is not a good pattern. Most storm systems will be deflected into the Pacific Northwest and Southwest Canada, and the East Coast will be seeing pronounced cold weather as they are seeing this week, and this may be a recurring pattern that we see through the winter. So I'm quite pessimistic. We will break this ridge down. It will rain. It can have snow occasionally in the winter. It's not going to be a total dud. But when we start looking at some of the forecasts here, the trends are towards drier than average. So temperatures, there's a better chance that it's going to be warmer than average. On the right is a multi-model ensemble forecast. The grayed out areas is where the model does not show skill through much of the central United States. But for the southern tier of the United States and Arizona in particular, historically this model has shown skill. And these models strongly indicate that we're going to be warmer than average through the winter. Now, that's not good because warmer than average generally puts snow levels up. And so instead of last year where our snow levels were frequently 4,000 foot, 3,000 foot, add another 1,000 foot, so you're losing a lot of that area that can accumulate snow through the winter. So warmer than average is definitely not good for us. Looking at the temperature trace since 1950 over Arizona, you might have thought, oh, last winter was a nice, cool, wet winter. In reality, last winter was actually pretty much near average or slightly below average. We've just seen so many years in the past 2 decades, which has been warmer than average, that comparatively last year seemed cool. But in reality, when you compare it to the longer term, it hasn't been. And that's one of the studies we've seen is we've seen these warmer than average temperatures, and I was just talking to Nancy about this, is you put warmer than average temperatures, you lose snow, and you increase evaporation. That's definitely not good for water resources. Looking at the precipitation outlook, unfortunately, the same models that we use show favored for below average precipitation through the winter season. The same multi-model forecast has shown skill over the southwest United States in previous years, and this is a scary growing trend I've seen in these models. Every run seems to get drier and drier for California and Arizona. This is not a good trend that I like to see. I'd rather see the models flipping back and forth, having more uncertainty, but the fact that they continually show dry weather over the southwest United States is not a good trend. This is the precipitation trend for January through March for Arizona. Yes, last year was good, but it was not nearly record-breaking. There were many more years that were a lot better than last year. It did us well in Arizona, but comparatively to the last several years, it was good, but we've been on this trend where winter precipitation has not been good in Arizona. Interest in the upper basin, this is the western Colorado basin. Last year was a great year for them. They received record amounts of snowfall, and looking at this trace, it was pretty much the second wettest January through March period that western Colorado has seen. Luckily, this is very good for the Colorado River, and probably has kept us out of the shortage tier at least for one more year. But after this winter, I'm quite concerned that that may change. This is the scary plot for me. Nancy showed October. This is June through October. This incorporates all of the monsoon and the first part of the water year. You can see that all of northern Arizona, the Four Corners, and even a lot of the upper Colorado Basin is in the 30 to 50% of normal range. That just demonstrates how poor the monsoon was. And outside of a few spots in central area and southern Arizona, which really, we're not accumulating snow in these areas, this is quite scary. This equated to pretty much the record driest monsoon that we've seen through much of northern Arizona and the Four Corners. This may come back to bite us because with all the heat we had over the summer and the complete lack of rain, I'm worried that even if we receive average snowfall this winter, that how dry our soils have become over the past 5 to 6 months, that a lot of the future runoff is going to go into soil replenishment, the moisture just being soaked up into the soil rather than runoff. We saw this back in 2018 where some of the runoff was much lower than we expected, and we can only surmise it's because the soils were so incredibly dry. We're heading towards that again, unfortunately. So just in summary, neutral conditions. Neutral doesn't offer much skill for us. The odds are shifted towards warmer than normal temperatures. The models show that. The trends show that. The water temperatures may be some influence towards drier conditions, and we're showing a slight risk that we will be drier than normal this winter, and the models can just trending this way every update. And then my big concern is that the antecedent dry soils are really going to negatively affect the runoff for the upcoming water year, even if we get normal snowfall. So with that, there's our advertisement, and I will take any questions.
Questions for Mark? Thank you, I think.
Sorry.
Thank you, though. Next, we have Brett Eslin, who will give us a Colorado River water supply update.
How many times in a row can you hear the exact same bad news? Go 3. So looking at the current Colorado River system conditions, this is as of Thursday last week, so it was the most updated I could get to you by today. Lake Mead, we have at a 39% of storage capacity, 1082.73 feet. Lake Powell, 53%, 3612.6 feet. The upper basin, because of the wet winter that we had last year and the good runoff and everything, did a lot better than they were predicting. If you take something like Blue Mesa, for example, last year in October, that was at 29% capacity. They were actually afraid it was going to take 2 or 3 years to fill. But because of the great runoff, it actually filled in 1. And then total system, we're at just over 50%, 29 million acre feet. Now we look at the 24-month study, which the Bureau of Reclamation puts out every month. Looking at the end of year, we see that Lake Powell will be a little lower than current, 3609, and Lake Mead will be a little higher than current, 1088.59. Now these are based on the October 24-month study, and the November 20-month study unfortunately didn't come out before today, but it'll most likely come out at the end of this week. So those numbers will change a little bit. We're looking at the Lake Powell 24-month study. Okay, we can see that there is the orange line is actually a chance of going into surplus, going into equalization. And right now we're looking at that being about a 13% chance. That was back in August, probably gone down since then. So once Powell has to equalize, then it becomes the blue line elevation. And then you can see that there's also a most probable and a min probable. Most likely by the end of next year, Powell will be at 3618, which is above the 3575. So Powell will be in a normal or ICS surplus condition. I should say an upper balancing elevation for Lake Powell. And when you look at Lake Mead, there is a chance of the equalization release from Powell, just that blue line. Increases our elevation very healthily. Most likely not going to happen. Then there's a green line, which is the most probable. You'll see that the most probable is actually below the red line, which is the minimum probable. This is because in the minimum probable, we actually get an April adjustment. So instead of an 823 release, we're going to get a 9.0 release, which increases the elevation of Lake Mead, which puts the minimum probable at a higher elevation. Right now, I think we're looking at 1076 and some change for the April adjustment. That's in April, looking at the end of September. And that has consistently gone down over the last couple months, which I can show you in a little bit. And we're looking at everything that they were talking about, Nancy and Mark, about the rainfall, the snowpack, the upper elevation, or the upper basin. So last year, we were above average, 120%. This year, we're looking at being below average for the most probable at 88%, so 9.5 million acre foot inflow. There is the slight chance of a great and a slight chance of a not so great. But yeah, looking at the average, it's not looking horrible, but it's definitely not looking as good as last year. So if we look at the inflows into Lake Mead, these are the intervening flows in between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. You can see that from October to last year to June of this year, we were above 100% every single month. And even though June is 400%, it's still only 70,000 acre feet. But that is good. And then you can see the effects of not having any rain and having higher than average temperatures. That for the last 4 months, we've been severely under average for the inflows into Lake Mead, which is dropping its predicted elevation for next year in September down. So there is that chance of getting the April equalization, or April adjustment, I should say. So looking at end of water year 2020, you see that 1076.67. So between now and April, if the intervening flows stay the same as they've been for the last 4 months, if that shows under 1075, then we will get the April adjustment, and Lake Powell will release an extra 770,000 acre-feet from Powell to Mead, which will help out the elevation of Mead. But based on everything that we've seen so far, we're looking at ending the calendar year of 2020 at 1081.25. We're looking at Powell ending at around 3618 for the end of year 2020, which means that based on the August study of next year, which will determine how we're going to operate, we will not be in shortage conditions as of right now. Which, yes, that is a good outlook, but that's only 6 feet, and a lot can happen between now and then. It can give us a lot more or take away that 6 feet. So it's not a zero probability, but for right now, it's a healthy chance that we will not be in shortage. But because of the elevations, next year we still will have to do the DCP Tier 0, 192,000 contribution as of right now. And I can take any questions if you have them.
Questions? I have one for you. How much conserved water is in Lake Mead? How many feet approximately?
As far as conservation goes, we'll say since the beginning of time, which is really only 2012, we're looking at about 35 feet based on the Bureau's last calculation, which means we would be into a Tier 2 shortage right now had that conservation not happened.
Okay. And one of the concerning things that I saw in Mark's presentation was the projections for California and all that red. They're pretty full up over there right now with their water supplies, but if they have a bad winter, it will reduce their ability to create conservation in Lake Mead potentially. Maybe not enough to impact us in 2021, but it's a bad trend in terms of losing precipitation, higher temperatures, and then trending towards less flexibility for folks to create conservation, all adding up to potentially lower elevations of Lake Mead out into the future.
Correct.
So just wanted to point those things out.
Between the 3 lower basin states, which is Nevada, Arizona, and California, right now they have plans for ICS creation of 625,000 acre-feet for this year. And that's very healthy. They do have the ability to lower those numbers if they wish. They also have the ability to take ICS if things go very south very fast. Someone like California can take up to 400,000 acre-feet in a year if they wish to do so. And you're looking at Lake Mead being about 83,000 acre-feet right now. 83,000 acre-feet, 1 foot of elevation. So California has the ability to drop us about 5 feet in any given year if the conditions continue to be as bad as they are, which from 2020, we're looking at just over 6 feet. So that puts us a lot closer to being in a shortage tier.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Thanks, Brett. And I saw another person sneak in from CAP. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Orestes Morphine. I'm here for Mohammed Mahmoud today.
Thanks, Orestes. Okay, we'll move on then to Stephen Flora and the report on Salt and Verde River watersheds.
All right, thank you. I'll keep following the trend. Hopefully not quite as bad as the rest of the outlooks here, but we'll see how it goes. So I'll talk about a little bit about Salt River Project water supply and the Salt and Verde river watershed status over the last water year and this monsoon season. So if you look at where we were a year ago, we were about 46% full in the entire SRP system. Roosevelt was about 38. The Verde was at 29, leading into, this was following the very dry winter of 2018, leading into last winter. And then following that there, as was pointed out, we had a fairly good winter last year, and that was the case on the Salt and the Verde. And so at the end of the winter in early May, we were kind of at our peak at about 81% total capacity. So this was
So you can see Roosevelt was up to 77%, and the Verde actually filled and spilled about 100,000 acre-feet of water throughout the winter. So this put us actually a little bit higher than we were prior to the very dry 2018 from the wet 2017 winter. So basically got us back plus a little from that very dry 2018 winter as far as the reservoir system. If you look at the winter, you can see here that this was the last winter, just a real summary, real brief. You can see that very dry. That was the record in 2018 of 100,000, the lowest inflow we saw on record. And we saw more than 10 times that in 2019 with 1.12 million acre-feet of water, which is about 210%. So you can see that difference quite a bit, that made up that difference. And during the month of March, as I mentioned, we spilled about 100,000 acre-feet on the Verde system as those reservoirs filled. And you can see some of those large events there in February and March when we had that large snowstorm where we had snow levels down to 3,000, 4,000 feet in elevation. So if we look at the precipitation over the Salt and Verde watershed on average throughout the entire water year, we can see that we were slightly above normal at about 114% of normal. Just kind of going back to mention about last winter, as we pointed out, we had that very wet October, and that really helped because this winter precipitation was just slightly above average for the watershed. So this actually helped to saturate that watershed. So we saw 2 times the median inflows from slightly above precipitation. So this really helped to see some of those flows from that snowpack and runoff last winter to give us a fairly good water year runoff for that winter. Here's the typically dry season, and then you can see our monsoon, as I mentioned, was quite below until we had this very last event in September. If we look at this a little closer on the monsoon, as they mentioned, we got kind of a late start because we had that good winter and that cool spring. So we really didn't start seeing precipitation until later in July on the watershed. We saw some smaller events. Not much happened. We had a break, saw a couple more smaller events. And then we had this very large event that was at the end of the monsoon, more of that subtropical system with the winter system starting transitioning to fall. So this is really the only monsoon event where we saw any runoff from the monsoon. We don't typically see a lot of runoffs from the monsoon, so that wet winter was crucial to boost our reservoir systems. But we do get a little bit, but you can see this was kind of the only event we saw. And if you look at this, most of that water happened over this area. This is the Superstition Mountains. They're just east of the Phoenix area in the lower part of the Salt watershed. And you can see all of this area here was part of that Woodbury fire that burned in 2000 or in June of this past year in 2019. So there was a lot of burned area in this watershed, all of that running down into the lower Salt reservoirs, in particular Canyon Lake. And so really nothing happened until about September 23rd. And we saw this happen. We saw about 6 inches plus at Horse Mesa Dam falling in a less than 6-hour period in the morning of September 23rd. And we saw Canyon Lake elevation jump up to 3 feet in a couple hours. And that's what necessitated those releases out of Canyon Lake and Saguaro Lake that we had in September 23rd, lasting into the 24th briefly. And we saw about 13,000 acre-feet of water total spilled over Granite Reef Dam. And that was from these lower salt inflows. The peak release was very briefly at 48 because the peak inflows estimated coming into Canyon Lake was about 50,000 CFS coming in on that lower salt into Canyon Lake. Which was probably the highest we've seen, and that was attributed to just the sheer amount of precipitation in that short period, as well as the recent burn area. We also had some other stuff on the lower Verde, below the Verde reservoirs that flow directly into the system. So that was about the only excitement we had this monsoon season. Otherwise, it was fairly dry, and so If you look at that, most of the inflow we saw was down here. This was the areas where we had above average in the lower salt. Unfortunately, that moved through the system and didn't add to the storage. We saw, average type some precipitation in the upper salt. The salt side did during the monsoon season just below, a little below normal, about 92% of normal. It didn't fare quite as bad. The Verde, on the other hand, was much drier, about 64% of normal on the Verde, especially in the upper part towards Flagstaff and Williams. We saw a very low monsoon precipitation. So if you look at some of the these areas up in the watershed, particularly the Verde, you'll see all of this red is below, departure from normal below, and you can see the percentages of normal, 25, 33, 39, 15. You can see several driest on records here in Flagstaff, Belmont, a couple other areas driest on record, 5th driest, 7th driest. You can see the trend there. So the Verde, on the other hand, was quite a bit drier. We didn't see from that late September 3rd, even though we had some precipitation, we didn't really see the response on the Verde system, on the Verde River. We did see a little bit of uptick on flow on the Tonto and Salt from that event. So we did see some response in flows. As you can see here, this is what we saw for the water gear. You can see quite the difference between the winter and the summer. Here you can see the monsoons in February and March. We had quite a bit of flows from those February storms, particularly on the Verde, and then on the Salt from snowmelt and other storms. So the Salt persisted fairly, with higher flows into the cooler parts that we had in the spring in May and June. But then from that point on, everything kind of kept at that base flow levels, with the exception of this little spike here on the Tonto and Salt that you can see. And we had about 141% of median, but that was mostly from the winter storms. And you can see the summer, we had some response, but not much, mainly from that last storm. And we've seen, level flows. And our inflow on the monsoon was about 45% of median. So again, we don't expect much inflow. We got a little less than half of median, but especially on the Verde, it could dry out conditions leading up to this winter. We don't typically see from year to year, it kind of starts over on the watershed, but it can have an impact. Last year we had that wet October that really helped us out. This year, well, as you've already seen, we don't have that leading into it. So so this is kind of the impacts from the last water year on the reservoir system and the reservoir management. As I mentioned, we got up to about 81% in May, and we're about 67% right now. And you can see this is the PROP plan, or the Project Reservoir Operations Plan. And so this kind of determines, based on the levels in the reservoirs, how allocation of water is made between our surface water supply and our groundwater supply. And you can see, as an impact from this winter, it brought reservoir levels up to a point where groundwater levels or groundwater usage for 2019 was reduced from down to 125,000 acre feet for the year. So more surface water was being used. Next year, it's projected to only have 100,000 based on our surface water levels. If we end up having that dry winter that Mark is showing us, then this might likely increase these numbers. These are based on lower quarter intile flows to the planning, and on a demand of 750,000 acre feet of water out of the salt system. So right now the mix is more towards surface water, 3 acre feet per acre and 0.3 acre feet per acre groundwater for next year, for 2020. So as far as the reservoir systems, they're in fairly good shape. But as you saw from 2018, that can quickly change in the system. the deliveries typically were on the salt in the summer. That's transitioned over to the Verde. Again, if we have that dry winter that you're expecting, expect that to transition back earlier in the year after the new year into the winter to the salt if we don't get those inflows to fill up the Verde side. So just kind of a quick recap. We started at about 47% at the beginning of the year. At about twice the median inflows in the winter, got up to about a little over 80% full, about half the median inflows in summer, and now we're currently at 67% full for the entire system, which is about a little over 1.5 million acre feet of water for the entire system. About 2/3 full in Roosevelt. So that brings us to the question that we've pointed out here. We get every fall whether we're going to have water in the reservoir spilling like we had last year, or we're going to have drier conditions. So to answer that, so far, as I mentioned, not so good. We don't have that wet October to get things started like we did last year, so conditions will be dry. So when we do start getting storms, we're going to have to a lot of that initial storms and snowpack may infiltrate in the ground, delaying some of the runoff unless we get a larger amount of precipitation into the winter. We've had barely a trace of, a little over a trace of in October. So far this year, so we're quite behind last year. As I mentioned, we had this ridge here, and we're kind of in neutral conditions, so we're not looking at the best outlook. So what does that mean? This is the December, January, February, which has equal chances, as Mark showed. A month later, the January, February, March, all of this below average shifted over here, and we had below average. The November, December, January had some green coming down into New Mexico, and you know, that gave us a little hope, but we haven't seen any of those storms materialize yet in November, so that's starting to fade. So we're trending more towards that January, February, March of below average projections in our planning. So. And finally, I just want to go back to this in the and kind of highlight over the last 10 years or so reservoir conditions. You can see the last time reservoirs were full were in 2010 at 100% full. We had a 2011 to 2016 very dry period. Actually, if you include 17, which was a wet above median year, but 18, which was our lowest on record, we had the lowest consecutive 8-year annual inflow on record into the Salt and Verde watershed, into our reservoirs. If you go back even further, but you can see that from here, our reservoir levels as of May 1 really didn't drop below 50% total storage. So the SRP reservoir system is fairly, based on the planning and adaptation to the drought conditions, fairly maintain those levels kind of around 50% or so in those drier periods, or slightly below. If you go back even further to 1996, when all this drought started, the lowest consecutive 23-year annual inflow record. And this projection here shows this solid line here is our current drought, mega drought that we're in, and this is from a publication, Kevin Murphy, looking at the Salt and Verde watershed reservoir system and comparing it to other mega droughts in the past. In the tree ring record, you can see several of these other more severe droughts. You can see that we're getting to that point. This is the most severe in the tree ring record, so we're getting to that point in that 30-year drought cycle, and you can see we had this part here where reservoir levels dropped fairly low. We were like 20-some% back in the early 2000s, but we had this even more stretch, which is right here, but our reservoir levels stayed around 50%. So with this planning, this use of surface water, groundwater use, it's a maintained more resilient supply, sustainable supply in the reservoir system. And so these droughts have seen, 20 to 30 plus years, these mega droughts in the record. So the question is, well, is it going to continue? Maybe this year. but is it going to trend and end? Eventually, these move into a more pluvial, but when is that going to be? Next year, 5 years from now, is really the question. So, for this year, for projections on inflow, here's what I'll put down. You'll have to tune in May when we come back to see what happens. But as we said before, that outlook kind of looks dry right now, so we may be trending towards one of these years. So just to kind of recap, we had that winter that brought reservoir storage up above 80%. Right now it's 67. We had a monsoon, dry monsoon, but we did have the one 1,000-year, greater than 1,000-year event on the lower salt occur. But those winters are really what's crucial. So we'll see what happens, whether this year's wet or dry. We're trending dry. So that's where we're going to head and plan for. So any questions?
Questions for Stephen? Thank you. Next up, we have a report on the 2019 wildfire season and forest health update from both Byron Kimball and John Richardson. Which one's going first? Byron?
So good morning. Again, my name is Byron Kimball. I'm with the Department of Forestry and Fire Management, and I'm the state fire planner for them. I do a lot of the fire history and whatnot. So fire season 2019 was kind of presenting itself as being rather calm just because of the moisture that we had all winter. It got off to kind of a calm start, but then as we went into it, things got going. Just the historical trends, some stuff from that we saw before, 50-50 split between human and lightning. Human-caused fires are more prevalent in the springtime, and then lightning tends to kick in as the monsoon comes. And we look at a number of things. We look at drought. We look at fine fuel condition. We look at what the seasonal temperatures and precip are going to do. What's our weather doing in the early spring and early summer? And then the monsoon that typically ends our season are the things we look at for how our season is going to work. This year, a lot of those things, early season, we were wet. We had lots of fuel. Had a really good winter. We're looking to have some decent temperatures and not a whole lot of precip during the early spring into the summer. And then they weren't too sure what the monsoon was going to be, but we didn't think it was going to be all that great. Well, that's what it played out to be. I think it played out even worse than we initially thought it might have been, of not being anything. So this year, so far, the year-to-date numbers here on the left have actually gone up a little bit for all state and federal fires. So far this year, we've had just over 1,800. We've ticked up a little bit. The acres haven't changed a great deal, about 372,000 acres for all of our state and federal partners. For just the state, about 438 fires for not quite 15,000 acres that were direct state responsibility fires. So you can see, compared to last year, our numbers of fires are about the same, but our acres are significantly greater. Lots of these fires were, particularly early fires, were in fine fuels. Robert can attest to the fact that we had a uptick in our activity out in the western part of Maricopa County, where these were related to fuel conditions in the desert that most people hadn't seen in quite a while. There were guys out there doing normal things, and they were starting fires, and so we had that uptick. So significant fires over 100 acres. These are the ones that people typically tend to hear about. 68, 69 significant fires across the state for about 353,000 acres. So notice that of the acreage that we talked about, the 371,000, and with 1,700, 1,800 fires, the vast majority of that acreage was involved in 69 fires. Fires were involved, or of those 69 fires, they were managed under multiple strategies. Some of those were direct full suppression fires. A lot of those fires were what we call management fires. They were fires that were ignited by lightning, but that were managed for resource benefit. These were fires that the forest said, hey, this fire's in a good place. It's got good conditions. We're going to let it do its thing, and we're going to let nature play its course. And we saw many more of those than we had in the past. So you see all of our partners except for Fish and Wildlife Service had significant fires on their jurisdiction as we went through the year. Forest Service, though, had the vast majority of them. Some of those significant fires, the first 5 up there from Painted Wagon to White Wing, those are all state responsibility fires. Those fires all occurred out in the western part of Maricopa County. Believe it or not, you stand on any one of those fires and you can throw a rock and hit the other 4. They were within about 1.5 miles to 2 miles of each other over the course of about a month. And again, it was strictly because we had fine fuels in the desert. We had a grass layer that these guys were not, that folks were not cognizant of. A couple of these were started by gentlemen welding on their corral fences. Typical year, they're welding, throwing sparks, no big deal. This year, all of a sudden they got fire. And at least one of them, I believe it was the Patton fire that was started that way. The guy he may not even have realized that he had a fire going just because of how fine the fuel was. It was flash and gone. He's turning around, the ground is turning black. What's going on? All of a sudden you realize you've got a fire going. But very, very long term. Then we got into the heart of our fire season, and we had the Woodbury fire on the Tonto National Forest that burned for almost a month, 123,000 acres. That was our large fire pretty much for the year. That fire took a big chunk of resources, major impact to a number of different partners and a number of different parts of the state as that fire burned through the Superstition Wilderness. Smokehouse and Jomax, again, were state responsibility fires down here in Maricopa County, again in the desert. Notice those 2 occurred on the same day. We had Smokehouse occurred first, and then we got another report, and so we were scrambling to get resources into places that we needed to get. Museum fire was the other one that caught everybody's attention up in Flagstaff for not quite 2,000 acres. It had potential to go to about 35,000 acres, but we were able to get on it pretty quick and move and had a bunch of resources. This was one of those years where we didn't ever really hit resource drawdown in the state. Our large fire activities was scattered enough that we always had enough resources to get to things. And so we weren't ever really truly scrambling to find resources. It was all told, it was a rather calm fire season, really. Significant fires, these were all managed fires. The reason I really bring them up, though, is to look at the acreage over here on the far right side. In a normal fire season, if you saw acres like that, you would think these were full suppression fires that were out raging through the forest that would have had quite a large bill associated with them and would have had a major commitment of resources. Most of these fires were managed by Type 4, Type 3 organizations, on-forest organizations. You might have had a hotshot crew or 2 assigned for a couple of days as they did, supported a line or something. Not a heavy commitment of resources to any of these fires, and yet the forests were able to accomplish quite a bit because of the calmer, the nice spring that we had, the good summer we had. Didn't ever really get our high triple digits that we often get that lead into the monsoons. I believe they didn't occur this time until August for about a week, and so it was just we never really did develop those conditions for those monsoons. So we've continued fires through. That being said, we're still getting fires. Fires are still burning. The fuels are still present. It is still very dry because we didn't get the monsoons. We didn't get the green up. We got a couple of little spurts. The warm season grasses grew in a number of places, and now they've dried out, and we are still getting fires. 2 weeks ago, when I wrote this, 34 fires across the state. This past week, we had 17 fires across the state, all jurisdictions. We are supporting our partners across the West. We sent, at our high point, we had 30, almost 40 pieces of equipment in California, supporting California. Most of those resources are either home or are returning. I think we're still showing 25, 26 engines, but most of those will be timing out here within the next couple of days, should be on their way home. The fuel conditions are going to be present out there. We typically see, if conditions don't change, we'll see fires here in the desert now for about 3 years before that fuel layer is out there that's been beaten down by just weather and traffic enough. So I would expect to continue to see things. Now with a warm and dry winter, we'll see how that leads to us as we move through to next year.
All right, hello everyone. I'm John Richardson. I'm a Forestry Programs Administrator for the Department of Forestry and Fire Management. I'm going to give a quick and brief report on the summer activity. So, quick background, annually our department conducts an aerial detection survey for dead and dying trees. We partner with the Forest Service and are looking out either sides of a plane about 1,000 feet above the ground. We have certified arborists, entomologists, service foresters. We ground truth that data and then provide land managers and the public with information regarding those surveys. One other thing I always like to mention is times of significant drought, trees will become increasingly stressed and highly susceptible to insect and disease infestation. So for 2019, and this is preliminary draft data, part of the reason why this is going to be shorter than normal is we're still crunching all the numbers in developing our forest health conditions report, but there's about 455,000 acres of trees impacted by bark beetles this year, and that was actually an increase of 65% from 275,000 last year. We had a wet winter, and what we're seeing this summer was a lot of residual holdovers from the big explosion of bark beetles we had in 2018. Hard to see in this picture, but this is more typical of what we were seeing this year in terms of new dead and dying trees, kind of individual, and then occasionally we'll get little pockets of mortality. So again, there's 2018, kind of in what we refer to the transitional zone, so where pinyon juniper woodland is transitioning into ponderosa pine. And there's 2019. Last time I was here, I was showing what was happening in 2001, 2002, 2003, and the percent increases we were seeing. 2017 and 2018 was big for us. It seemed like it was very similar to the 01, 02 time period where we had a pretty significant drought. And then 2019, again, like I said, we had a wet winter, and that somewhat knocked down that increase. So there was still an increase. There were still a lot of generations of bark beetles that were still within trees doing what they do. And when they emerged, they continued to cause damage. So if we look at those same numbers and then look again from like if we're looking at June, for instance, you'll see that in 18 it was pretty horrible, and in 19 it was much better. So while there was an increase, it was not the increase that we would have expected to see from like 2002 to 2003, where it jumped from 500,000 to almost 1.7 million acres. Forest and woodland vegetation, they're showing signs of improvement from some of those record precipitations that we did receive in certain areas. However, there's still some lingering effects, and we did expect that. Pinyon juniper woodlands are actually continuing to show decline, and there's some concern in that vegetation type. Another event that occurred that was pretty interesting was defoliation of aspen pretty much across northern Arizona due to a foliar blight called black leaf spot. There's about 34 acres that were affected, and that was actually due to a really wet winter. So this is actually native. It's a native foliar blight, and it erupted because of all the precipitation, the high moisture we had. So some final thoughts. Healthier trees are better able to defend themselves from bark beetle attacks. Wet winters are really important. The fact that we had a very weak monsoon and what Mark was mentioning about potentially our forecast of not another winter like we had last year, I could see this somewhat rebounding. There's still the potential for damage due to that exceptionally high population and the damage we saw in 2018 and these holdovers we're still seeing in 2019. So it's hard to look into the crystal ball and see exactly what it'll look like, but the potential is there. And if we get another, if we have a dry winter or a below average winter, I would expect to see this to jump back up again. Also, we will be producing our 2019 Arizona Forest Health Conditions Report, and it'll be posted to our webpage at dffm.az.gov. Thank you.
Any questions for either John or Byron? Seeing none, we will move on to agenda item 7, discussion of the drought declaration recommendation. We probably would want to summarize some of the key points we heard today. Anthony, do you want to weigh in right now, and then after that I will weigh in?
Yep. I'll just start by saying that I've heard nothing, either in the short-term or long-term outlooks that would justify deviating from our practice since 1999 of extending this declaration. But in summary, some things that are significantly concerning for us in the consequence management realm are the indications that we're going to have a warmer than average winter going into spring, and the indications are that the snowpack will be impacted by that, and the related runoff, which we see as being beneficial to what we have for future 2020 wildland fire season. And that is really the heart and basis of my recommendation to you, Director, that we extend this declaration.
Thank you, and I second all those comments you made. I mentioned already my concern about California looking dry as well, how that can impact us. The other thing that was striking for me was the discussion by Stephen about the mega drought and where we're at since 1996, Salt and Verde River. We're seeing the same thing on Colorado River in terms of mega drought and the tree ring record there. And the fact that they're occurring almost in the same time frame is very concerning. We've always been very concerned with simultaneous drought and mega drought on both the Colorado River and Salt and Verde River systems and the impact that has on our renewable water supplies in the state. So with that, I also agree, given where we're trending from last spring, trending drier, and projections for the winter being warmer and drier, that I too believe that the drought declaration recommendation to the governor should be to keep the drought declaration in place. Opportunity now for members around the table to weigh in with their thoughts. I'm seeing heads shaking yes in agreement with that recommendation. Does anyone have any specific concerns they want to raise or to add to the reasoning for continuing the declaration? Not seeing any. I think we have a consensus that we will make the recommendation to the governor to keep the drought declaration in place. We will write up that letter of recommendation and get it off to the governor's office. With that, we'll move on to item 8, comments on the 2019 Arizona Drought Preparedness Report. DWR is required to submit an annual drought report to the governor's office by the end of the fiscal year for the previous water year. The 2019 drought report covers the drought conditions and preparedness activities for this water year, October 1, 2018 through September 30th, 2019. It includes a summary of Arizona's drought status this past water year and the outlook for the next water year, drought designation information, and then some of the highlights that we already talked about. Thanks to all who provided updates to the report. We did send the final draft to this group last week for review and comments. Are there any additional comments at this point in time? Do folks feel they need some more time to get us comments in writing, or have you had a good opportunity to see the report and we're pretty good with finalizing it? Given that, we will move on to finalize the report and then submit it to the governor's office with our recommendation letter, and we will be posting the report as well on DWR's website, specifically on our drought webpage. So with that, it's time for a call to the public. Does anybody in the audience or on the phone have comments to present to the group from our agenda? Seeing none, I want to thank all of you again for not only the presentations and discussion today, but we know how much work you do throughout the year on all the groups you provide input into, and that these biannual meetings are just really the summary of all the good work you have done, and I want to thank you for that work and your commitment. And I guess with that, we're adjourned.